My name's Tilman Ruff, and I'm pleased to be invited to speak to you today about the ongoing threat that's posed by nuclear weapons. I'm pleased to do so from Wurundjeri land, pay my respects to their leaders emerging present and past. So nuclear weapons have only been around for 3/4 of a century, but have changed things like nothing else. Even before they're used in a nuclear war, they exact a very substantial health and environmental toll. The over 2,000 nuclear weapon tests that have been conducted, including in this country, have contaminated vast areas of land for geological time, affected those most close to those tests, sometimes very severely. In some communities, whole communities in outback Australia getting acute radiation sickness, reflecting very substantial radiation exposure. And the estimated legacy of several million long-term cancer deaths will stick with us. There's also a major opportunity costs from these gargantuan instruments of destruction. Global military spending is on the rise. It's currently $1,917 billion US, almost $250 US per person alive. And it seems to go up despite recessions and pandemics. The US alone accounts for almost 40% of that, and Australia, surprisingly much greater than its population, is at number 13. In the US, the largest spender, almost half, in fact exactly half, of discretionary government spending goes on the military. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute some years ago estimated just what proportion of military spending devoted to meeting the sustainable development goals that all countries have signed on to, estimated that around 5 or 6%, which roughly equates with the nuclear weapons spend, would meet all of the health goals in the SDGs, or the water and sanitation and ecosystem and biodiversity goals, and the emergency and humanitarian goals put together. So there are extraordinary opportunity costs from doing the things we need to do. This graphic just compares the expenditure represented by the size of the circles of some key international humanitarian and health organisations compared with the gargantuan red circle represented by military spending. And recently in the COVID pandemic, people have done these sorts of comparisons of equivalent costs in health terms versus in military terms. The F-35 fighter aircraft that Australia is in the process of buying 70 of, for example, just operating those for 1 hour is sufficient to employ a nurse for a year. It's estimated that increasing global health spend by roughly as much as global military spending per person would essentially save almost 100 million lives and increase life expectancy between 3 to 8 years globally. So huge opportunity costs from that diversion of resources. But the biggest threat, of course, that these weapons posed is what happens if they're actually used in conflict. Nuclear weapons can be almost limitless in size. The largest single test explosion at 50 megatons contained about 4 times the explosive power of all of the explosives used in all wars throughout human history. But of course, nuclear weapons have unique capacities as well in terms of their ability to spread indiscriminate long-term hazardous radiation and cause global climate disruption, which I'll say more about. There are currently about 13,500 weapons, more than 90% of them owned by Russia and the United States. Almost 4,000 deployed at any point in time, almost half of those on high alert, ready to be launched within a few minutes of a decision to do so. Their average size at 200 kilotons, 200,000 tons of high explosive equivalent, is about 13 times the size of the, by today's standards, relatively small tactical sized nuclear weapons used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that between them killed about 250,000 people by the end of 1945. But there are still multi-megaton range weapons currently deployed. The World Health Organization, when it examined the effects of nuclear war on health and health services back in the early 80s, and has repeated this conclusion since, stated unequivocally that nuclear weapons constitute the greatest immediate risk to human health and welfare. They documented that no health service or combination of health services was up to the task of managing the casualties, even of a single nuclear explosion over an urban centre. And therefore, in health terms, the only logical approach was primary prevention, that is, preventing this from ever happening in the first place. The Red Cross, the world's largest humanitarian organisation, the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, similarly has repeatedly, I've quoted one example here, after a detailed study, assessed that there is no feasible or current international humanitarian capacity that could in any way respond meaningfully to the casualties of nuclear weapons use. The most important new science that we now understand relates to the impact of nuclear weapons, relates to their climate impact. People are used to thinking about climate change as related to uncontrolled global heating, but there's an equivalent opposite, if you like, climate threat that we also subject the healthy, sustainable, hospitable climate that we need for human and ecosystem flourishing. And that's the risk of an abrupt ice age conditions, essentially, from nuclear winter. Let me explain the science behind that. Nuclear weapons are extraordinarily efficient at igniting simultaneously hundreds of thousands, millions of fires over very large areas, consuming essentially everything flammable that will burn: wood, cloth, paper, plastics, petrochemicals, hydrocarbons, asphalt, vegetation, anything flammable. It's estimated that even the relatively small weapon used in Hiroshima released about 1,000 times more energy in the fires that it ignited than the explosive power of the weapon itself. And about 13 square kilometres comprehensively burnt in the Hiroshima firestorm. But a modern megaton range weapon, say a 5 megaton Chinese long range missile heading for my fair city, Melbourne, would ignite an area of around 45 kilometres across. That whole area of 1,600 square kilometres would burn at over 800 degrees Celsius, consuming most of the oxygen, and essentially nothing could survive within that confluent fire zone. Those fires would inject millions of tonnes of black smoke high into the atmosphere. The scenario that's been most often studied by atmospheric science groups is an India-Pakistan nuclear war. Been to war 4 times since independence, long contested borders, regular shooting across them, terrorist acts on both sides. This is not an implausible scenario, of course, both nuclear armed, in fact, with the 2 most rapidly growing nuclear arsenals on the planet. So this scenario uses less than 2% of the global nuclear arsenal in terms of numbers and less than 1% of its explosive yield. The acute casualties would be horrendous. Absolutely don't bear contemplation, although contemplate them we must. But it's really the climate impacts that I want to draw your attention to. So depending on the size of the weapon, from Hiroshima size to 100 kilotons, this would loft between 16 and 36 million tonnes of black carbon into the atmosphere. That smoke would spread from South Asia over pretty much all of the inhabited regions of the planet within a couple of weeks. Taking a cross-section through the atmosphere, so South Pole on the left, North Pole on the right, up in the atmosphere on the y-axis, you can see that that smoke very quickly is up in the stratosphere and mesosphere, beyond the reach of weather, traverses the atmosphere north to south, and persists for very long periods, in fact, over a decade. The right graph here shows the temperature declines for different scenarios. The 50 kiloton scenario for the conflict I've described is this black line. This purple bar is the range of minimum temperatures that occurred during the last ice age on Earth about 20,000 years ago. So you can see that middling-sized nuclear weapons, not all of those in the Pakistan and India arsenals, targeted on one part of the world, would get us down to ice age temperatures, 3 to 4 to 5 degrees colder than present within a couple of days, essentially. That's the average. Much greater declines, about twice that or more, over the large continental interiors where most of the world's food is grown. So darker, colder, drier underneath that cloud of smoke for over a decade is not going to be great for agriculture. There are a whole range of other impacts, unprecedented levels of ozone destruction in the stratosphere from hot smoke that would deplete ozone to levels we haven't seen for many millions of years. Radioactive contamination, toxic chemical contamination from damaged industrial facilities, and crucially, loss of all the complex transnational inputs to modern agriculture of fuel, seed, fertilizer, machinery, and transport of agricultural products. So what I'll show you is essentially estimates based on the colder, darker, drier, but be aware this is very much an underestimate of impacts because it doesn't take all these into account or the synergies between them. And essentially, both on land and in the water, net primary productivity, so that's what the first trophic layer in ecosystems, plants, basically produce that's not used for their own growth and respiration, that's left over for animals like us to use. The total decline in net primary productivity over the globe from this small regional nuclear war would be roughly comparable to the total human consumption of food and fibre. So a very substantial decline, and of course not evenly distributed, but the most densely populated areas most vulnerable, that use more than they consume. We're not well positioned to withstand sustained substantial declines in food production of that magnitude over many growing seasons. About 700 million people are currently malnourished. About 2 billion people and growing are at least moderately food insecure at present. It's estimated that the economic and social impacts of COVID have increased that number of hungry people by roughly 100 million over the last year. Global grain reserves are currently about 3 months worth of consumption, and that's not too bad, but that's about as high as they ever get. That doesn't position us well to withstand substantial declines in production for over a decade. So it's pretty easy to see that this small localized nuclear war, small in nuclear terms, would put billions of people at risk of starvation without taking into account of the disease epidemics and likely further conflict that such a severe and extensive famine would trigger. Some of the climate scientists involved in this work have really highlighted that these are not weapons in any normal, targetable, confined sense. These are essentially global suicide bombs where the concept of winners and losers basically becomes nonsense. We would all lose if they're used. So how are we tracking? What's the danger? And then what's the way forward? Well, currently, with some current small positive steps notwithstanding, at least stopping the decline in the renewal of the New START Treaty, the last remaining treaty constraint on nuclear weapons between the US and Russia, thankfully, in the first days of the Biden administration. But basically, there are no current negotiations underway. We have seen the hard-won treaty gains that have constrained nuclear development and numbers since the end of the first Cold War progressively abrogated. Not only that, all of the 9 nuclear-armed states are not just sitting pretty on their arsenals, they're actually modernizing them with new capacities, increasing the flexibility of their use, their accuracy, and so forth. Massive sums invested, projected over very long time periods, and involving weapons types that we have not seen previously. Probably the best known and a very authoritative assessment of how we're tracking is the Doomsday Clock, this annual assessment, which just a couple of weeks ago was left at 100 seconds to midnight, as far forward as it has ever been. In setting the clock last year, the board of sponsors, which includes 13 Nobel laureates, highlighted that the international security situation is now more dangerous than it has ever been, even at the height of the Cold War. And basically this year's saying the potential to stumble into a nuclear war has grown. Some nice talk, but really no serious action yet on climate. The 2 main areas that concern me about this growing danger, apart from the usual ones of accidents and madness and errors in complex technical and human systems, is the growing in this pink section of this graph over the last decade or so, the rapid growth in internationalized armed conflict. I think as the impacts of a climate stressed, heating world really start to bite, food and water insecurity, people on the move, this internationalized conflicts are on the rise. Each of these that involves the nuclear armed states poses a risk of escalation. And the other area is the offensive use of cyber technology. This is now a major investment, an area of development for upwards of 30 militaries around the world. Those who've commanded nuclear weapons in the past who've been able now to speak tell us that those command and control systems are vulnerable. And just a couple of months ago, we saw an absolutely unprecedented scale and depth of hacking of multiple US government agencies, including the agency that maintains US nuclear weapons. The fissile material, the plutonium and highly enriched uranium that puts the nuclear in nuclear weapons that you need just kilograms of to construct a weapon, exists in thousands of tons in stockpiles, military and civilian, mostly nuclear armed states, totals the equivalent of reconstituting the current global nuclear arsenal more than 10 times over. So keeping this material out of weapons is going to require a very strong, consistent rules-based order that works. Getting rid of these weapons has been at the forefront of the United Nations agenda since the very first resolution of the General Assembly in January 1946, called for the elimination of atomic weapons. We can take a lot of lessons and great heart from the very significant progress that has been made in controlling the other weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical, and the other major kinds of indiscriminate and inhumane weapons, landmines and cluster munitions. For all of them, codifying their rejection as unacceptable for all nations in a treaty that sets the same standard for all nations and provides the basis and motivation for the progressive efforts to eliminate those weapons has been the pathway for all of these. And no weapon has been controlled without first establishing that clear benchmark that these are unacceptable weapons that no nation should wield. But until very recently, that approach had not been tried with nuclear weapons. So as a result of many efforts, but of course, many supportive governments, but with a key civil society partner being the Campaign Coalition, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, Australia's first Nobel Peace Laureate, and a key role played by the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, really characterising the need for nuclear weapons elimination as urgent, unfinished humanitarian business, really helped to galvanise a process that led in 2017 to the negotiation of the first treaty prohibition of nuclear weapons. And that treaty now, as of 2 months ago, entered into force, achieving the 50 ratifications, and in fact has accrued a few since. And I'd be very hopeful, given the 120 plus nations that have supported this treaty at every step of its development, that this will continue to grow. So this is really an extraordinarily important and historic step to now have the last and worst weapons of mass destruction finally prohibited comprehensively. Not only is it an evidence-based treaty that provides this categorical prohibition, but it also is the only place in any international treaty where there is established a feasible framework, a pathway to get rid of the weapons for states with and without them, states that host them, states that assist in their possible use. There's a framework here for time-bound, verified plans subject to verification by an independent international authority to actually eliminate those weapons. There are also some landmark in the nuclear space obligations on victim assistance and environmental remediation for the victims of nuclear use and testing. One of the signs that this treaty matters is the level of consistent opposition it is and discomfort it has aroused among the nuclear armed states that are now being, for the first time, I think, really seriously challenged fundamentally about their right to continue to threaten all of us with this most acute existential threat that humans and the biosphere face. And it's interesting to see the arguments used here by the US in trying to convince its NATO allies to boycott the negotiations for the treaty. They're nothing to do with what was publicly stated at the time. They're all about recognition that this treaty would work as intended to delegitimize nuclear weapons and planning for their use. And I think there's also an element of the way that this treaty happened through the General Assembly in a way that couldn't be stopped by the largest and most powerful states was really bringing humanity and global democracy to nuclear disarmament in a way that hadn't happened before, which they don't like. This treaty has very strong support amongst the health and humanitarian sector, my area of work, and really room for everybody in civil society to engage with these issues because everybody has a bank account or a pension fund. There are vast sums of money invested in these weapons. This is the estimate in US dollars for the financial institutions' investments in nuclear weapons producing companies over just a recent 2-year period. As the writing is on the wall now with this treaty, a growing number of financial institutions are divesting from these weapons, including the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, some very large pension funds and banks and life insurance companies. Everybody can engage in this work. In Australia, banks, super funds and the insurance industry are estimated to have somewhere in the vicinity of $30 billion invested in those companies. And these tentacles go rather deep. Many of us who have university connections, our universities are involved in partnering with organisations with companies that make now illegal weapons of mass destruction, not an appropriate thing for a university to be engaged with. And I want to just reflect in closing that it's evidence-based advocacy. It was evidence of growing contamination of strontium-90 in children's teeth that helped to end atmospheric nuclear weapons tests. It was evidence about the absolutely catastrophic impacts of nuclear war and the realities of nuclear winter if nuclear war happened that convinced the leaders of the largest nuclear armed states almost to agree to eliminate their arsenals entirely back in the 80s. I've now had the privilege of being associated with 2 Nobel Peace Prizes recognising the key role of evidence-based advocacy that gains traction for IPPNW in helping to end the Cold War, for ICAN in helping to bring about the treaty to ban those weapons. So this is the existential question that we face. Will it be the end of nuclear weapons or the end of us? We all know what the answer to that question needs to be. Amidst all of the other urgent priorities and challenges that face us, I think this, in a sense, is the most acute, because getting rid of these weapons before they end us is an absolute precondition for keeping and protecting and sustaining and developing everything else that matters. So I think this is work for all of us, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons really does provide a light that shines down a pathway that we all must take. Thank you.